On that note, we're going to begin the program by having Dr. Ken Hansen begin our evening by making a land acknowledgement, so we'll remember the rights and the dignity of the people on whose land we are living at this moment in our time. Dr. Hansen.
Good day, my relations. How's everybody doing?
Very good.
I would like to introduce myself in a native way. My name is Kenneth Hansen. I'm a pre-ICWA adoptee. On my mother's side, my biological mother's side, I'm supposed to have heritage among the Makoche Shawnee, the Cherokee, and the Lakota peoples. This land was held in stewardship by Yokits and Mono people from time immemorial. It was taken, it's unceded land, but it was taken by the U.S. government through 18 treaties, which ended up not being ratified because after the treaties were signed, the government decided they weren't going to ratify any more treaties. So the land was taken, but the people were not compensated for it. People who lived in this area were Yokits and Mono peoples, and of the Yokits people from around this area. There's some names you've probably heard of, but maybe some you haven't. They include Gashoa, Ketchee, Chichansee, Chowchilla, Choinumni, and people along those lines. Mono people also, you know, their name for themselves is the Nim. Mono was bestowed upon them by colonizers. But they also came through the valley periodically. People traveled around a lot. There were not hard and fast borders and that kind of thing. So in case you didn't know that little bit of history, oh brother, in case you didn't know that little bit of history, now you know. And so at some point, you know, some of this land needs to find its way back to the original stewards. With that, Homotakio, I said thank you very much.
On that note, we're going to bring up the second respondent to Paul's presentation, and that would be someone you met a little before, Dr. Ken Hansen, who will speak to us about a group that Paul mentioned briefly, the indigenous community of the world, those who have been totally colonized, who have suffered such ravaging in the name of religion, not only the doctrine of discovery, but church practice and policy, all about the tragedy of what it is to be a minority in a dominant culture. Dr. Hansen, could you speak to us about what this means to you and your community? Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all again. Thank you, Pastor Paul, for your remarks. It's extremely educational. I enjoyed the talk very much. Let me first say I'm not a religious leader at all, so I make no claim to that. I do take part in ceremony with my adopted tribe, the Cholone people, and they are a California Indian tribe whose historic territory where they provided stewardship was over what is now presently Pinnacles National Park. They were relocated from there into the mission systems, Mission Soledad specifically. After the fall of the mission systems, they were cut loose. At one time, people had some land around Cayucas and where Hearst Castle is, and of course, during the gold rush days, they were swindled out of it. Survived the genocide of California Indians, where 300,000 people were reduced to 30,000 people by the state of California, and were relocated to the Bakersfield area and were among the founding population of Bakersfield. And they've been good friends for a good many years. And I work for them as tribal staff in addition to my position at the university. I'm a political scientist, so I tend to view everything through the lens of naming, framing, and blaming. It's kind of what politics is. And by definition, us here having this conversation is a political act, and it's an act of resistance. So this is an important conversation, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. If you're interested in kind of a native view of Christianity, there's a great book by a guy named Mark Charles. And he's Navajo and he's a Christian minister, and he ran an independent presidential campaign in 2020, a write-in campaign, because it's hard for ordinary folks to get on the ballot with all that, without all that corporate sponsorship and super PACs and all of that stuff. His book is entitled Unsettling Truths. And it has kind of a double entendre because it's about how do we unsettle our society from the settler mentality that we're socialized into from the time that we're very, very small. And he deconstructs Christianity to its, going back, how is it that Christianity becomes associated with empire, right? And he goes back to Aquinas and deals with that. Much of the book is about the doctrine of discovery. He deals with that. He deals with his own people's experience, the longest walk, which is, the Navajo equivalent of the Trail of Tears, and, how Father Abraham Lincoln is not really our Father Abraham is often depicted, and he's very much an agent of genocide, as were a lot of other people. So anyways, it's an excellent book about all of those things. Another point I'd like to make is, your heroes are not always our heroes. Sometimes the liberals are just as bad. Perhaps not meaning to be, but again, so much of the racism is baked into the system to the point where, like, if you want to kneel at a football game, as an act of protest because you're protesting racism, it's seen as you protesting the entire country. That's how baked in it is sometimes. There's a fellow by the name of Vine Deloria, who's the Lakota scholar, and he's basically, the father of American Indian studies as an academic field. He's written most of the canon when it comes to law, history, politics, and all of that. And he writes about how, essentially we have two religions in the United States. We have the professed Christianity on the part of the Christian nationalists who have written so much of our history, despite what the rest of us think, but also the secular religion. And a lot of the institutions protect that secular religion of the state, which is designed to further the interest of oligarchy, essentially. And so, if we're not running afoul of one, we're probably running afoul of the other, which is why so much of government policy has had such a negative effect on indigenous people in the United States. And then other countries have copied it, of course. There's an important case called the Ling decision from 1990. For 100 years, native religions, and I say that plural because there's not one native religion, there's a variety. But they were all outlawed during the Indian Wars when something called the ghost dance became popular among Western tribes. And the ghost dance scared the living hell out of all of these settlers, especially those, who were, the government hired a lot of Quaker and Methodist ministers to try to run reservations and try to run the Bureau of Indian Affairs because the politicians that had been running those institutions were notoriously corrupt. So their solution was to try to replace them with people of good moral character. It's an admirable goal, but none of these people were necessarily culturally competent or competent really at running a lot of things like government agencies. And so this, is presenting itself with, or manifesting itself in another set of difficulties. But the policy that results from this is highly destructive. And it goes along with the family separation policy, where children were taken and put in boarding schools to be Christianized and to be socialized into being good Americans. The theme was kill the Indian to save the man. And these boarding schools lasted for a century, as did the prohibition on practicing native religion. So now, what have we learned about when we try to make something illegal? Does it go away? Of course not. It just goes underground, or a black market emerges, to take care of whatever demand people have. So native religions went underground. And it's not till 1978, when Congress passes the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, that we're allowed to have ceremony again out in the open. Well, the Supreme Court, in the majority opinion, is written by Sandra Day O'Connor, who's at least a centrist, if not a liberal, on a lot of things, basically negated the Indian Religious Freedom Act. The reason being that it ran afoul of the secular interests of the state. And that's not really the terminology that she used in the opinion, but that is the way the Fine Laureate looks at it. And the issue here, a big difference between indigenous religions and the world religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and so on, is that native religions are very much place-based. We have sacred places where revelation happened, from time immemorial. And the United States of America, generally speaking, does not recognize those as being holy places. And so if it runs afoul of someone perhaps making a few bucks, then, well, we'll send the bulldozers in and they'll take care of it. And unfortunately, that's been a problem for hundreds of years now. How do we solve this? Well, at least in California, the state has included cultural and religious sites as worthy of environmental protection. Now, you would think that, freedom of religion being in the First Amendment, that we would have actual religious freedom protections under the law. But we don't. The First Amendment protects whatever version of Christianity you might identify with, but, not really much of anything else, unfortunately. So we have to turn to environmental laws to actually protect our places of worship. And because a lot of what used to be Indian land is in governmental hands, it may not have been all that well maintained, but at least it's in public hands and not private hands. We are increasingly beginning to get access to these places again. And, part of Land Back, which is a movement, is about getting stewardship, even if it's co-management, which is the policy of Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior. This is in part about religious freedom, even if that's not openly stated. Land Back is about getting back not just territory, but our rights. Our freedom to have our spiritual connections to those sacred places that we've had from time immemorial. I do want to, again, I don't want to run over too much, but I do want to thank the clergy and the congregation here at St. John Newman for hosting us, and for everyone who came and attended and listened tonight. Thank you all very much.
I think we could not have done better than to decide, drink from your own wells. We've got such wonderful people at this university and in this community in the Valley. We're so blessed. I'm going to let the Reverend have a chance, as he'd like. He'll be the last one to speak, to kind of wrap us up tonight, respond in any way he would like to the ones who presented things to him. Paul, your turn to send us away tonight with a blessing. Thank you.
Well, I feel we have been very blessed already, and I am not going to take up much more of your time. I do want to thank each of you very much for those thoughtful contributions. I feel like the opportunity is to learn. is to learn from one another. And, I just especially you, my friend, who's, is a Ken, I'm sorry, I don't have my friend Ken. I think just helping us like get literally the landscape, the sacred landscape where we are is it just opens the mind. And it helps us realize, okay, there's all sorts of ways to go at this issue. And how can the more I learn help me incorporate the broader views into my work? And literally, as you were speaking, I was like, we need to do more. InterFaith Alliance National needs to do more. And I was like, how do we do more? And I was like, okay, we're going to come up with it. And I was like, no, just listen. We'll figure that out later. But the opportunity here is to learn, to do more for one another. And hearing stories like that is just so important. So I want to thank you for that, all your stories and your information. Every time, I know you don't feel like you were preaching at me, but you were preaching to me.